And she was also a Sunday painter, you said.
Yes.
So I was wondering, what did she paint, and what did you think of her work, and did she paint in front of you?
I never saw her actually painting, which is strange, but there was a paint kit and an easel and things around, and it was a mysterious substance. I never painted until I was already 2 years in art school, so I'll be clear about that. But I always drew, and I was encouraged to draw, and there were always pictures of, calendars like Nolde and Matisse and Franz Marc, and I guess the Fauves, after I learned more about art history. So it just demystified the idea of what being an artist was. I liked it. Her paintings were typical, like still life, not particularly skilled, but
they never described them to me before.
Very genre-based, still lifes, basically.
Still life,
yeah.
And not landscapes.
I don't recall a landscape. I have one of her, when she died, in 1991, I hung on to a couple of her paintings, which I have at the house. Did I show them to you?
Yeah, you did. We were moving.
Yeah, anyway.
Okay, so you used to joke that when you were 6, you drew a frog, and your mother gave you a pat on the head.
Yes, that's been my business model.
What you didn't know until relatively recently was that your biological father, who died at 27 of a heroin overdose, was fascinated by natural history and sketched animals in little notebooks. How has this affected your original view of your artistic origins?
It's a fascinating idea that where do these interests come from? First of all, they're not just animals, they're insects specifically, which I love and have drawn thousands of. It makes me angry because I thought I invented myself out of the thin air. And, I will deflect that and deny it to my dying day.
One of the wonderful things about having a very young parent is that they still relate to being a child.
Often too much.
For example, your mother adored animals, as you do, and the two of you had a cat and a dog, and she kept a fish tank. What was your response to this fish tank? You said something funny about it to me recently.
What did I say?
I want turtles.
Oh, you get a 10-gallon fish tank as a kid and you're like, all right, what can eat those damn fish? So I put a turtle in there, and they did what the Eastern red-eared slider, and they did what they were supposed to do, eat the fish. Then my mother explained that you have to have another tank for the turtles. So I was like, off to the races, and at the height, I may have had 7 or 8 tanks in my room, plus an iguana cage that was made out of chicken broth. So I had aquatic turtles, semi-aquatic turtles, frogs, desert, and so on.
You used to refer to the Museum of Natural History as your babysitter, and you've also described to me wandering the museum's halls on your own. Can you tell us why you would have been alone at the museum? Because that seems a little unusual.
It doesn't make much sense logically, but my mom, as we've discussed, worked at the Museum of Natural History for, I think, maybe 2 years as Margaret Mead's assistant to the secretary. And my mom, if you don't know, is a archaeologist, so she continued in that tradition afterwards. But she loathed Margaret Mead, who was actually quite cruel to the people that worked for her. And I think my memory of wandering around the Museum of Natural History alone is really that I got lost once. I still get lost whenever I go there. And I think that I must have been lost for maybe an hour, wandering around the Hall of North America, which is basically a series of labyrinthian things. And I do remember the Hall of African Mammals is an incredible apotheosis of stagecraft and genius. But I remember as a kid seeing them building the Hall of Ocean Life and the Reptile Hall, and I just was fascinated.
When you were a kid?
Yeah, in the 70s.
Oh wow, I didn't know them.
Late 60s, sorry.
And what about Charles R. Knight?
Well, Charles R. Knight, does anyone know who Charles R. Knight is? 2. Charles R. Knight is the great dinosaur painter from the end of the 19th century through the 40s, basically, who did the murals at the Museum of Natural History and the Field Museum where Mark just was. They are the greatest cycle of work about describing convincing ecologies that I think were one of the most important artistic experiences for me as a kid, looking at a bunch of fossils and then seeing this painting of what it would have looked like while it was alive was just mesmerizing, and I'm still quite fascinated. We have two Charles Knight drawings in our house still now.
So your stepfather entered the picture when you were about 7, although the dates are always changing on
shape-shifting,
that.
yeah.
And how do you remember feeling about this big change? I know you then took a new last name, Rockman.
Yep.
Rockman is his stepfather's last name.
And he adopted me, so that felt great. And then his family really didn't like my mother or myself, so that again was painful and made me, I guess, angry from being rejected again, because basically my mother isn't Jewish, and they were very Jewish Australians, so that was hard.
Let me just,
sorry.
Because I'm going to lead into the next
Okay.
thing. So suddenly there was money, though.
Yes,
And
there was.
you've mentioned a trip your mom and your stepfather, whose name was Russell, took around the world, and an early trip to Australia as being very formative for you. So I thought maybe you could just talk about the Rockman family, because they're a prominent Australian family.
They were in insurance and real estate, from the refugees from Hitler's Germany and Eastern Bloc geography, and they ended up in Melbourne, Australia, and they owned hotels, and my uncle was the mayor of Melbourne when I was a kid, and it was very glamorous. But also there was a very dark side to it that my stepfather, Russell, who I loved, was also tormented because he wanted to be a jazz musician, and he tried to get away from them, and he came to New York, which is the center of ground zero for jazz, if you're interested in jazz. And he got, again, like my biological father, involved with being a heroin addict, and it destroyed his life. And he was always beholden to them economically, because it was very hard to make money being a jazz musician. Probably forever, unless you're very lucky and talented. And but it showed me, I saw his work ethic. He practiced every day, and how to be obsessed with something as an artist, and how to work. And he also introduced me to horror movies.
And Irvin was your
Uncle.
Okay. His turtle collection, you said, impressed you.
Oh, so
Can you tell us about that?
Absolutely. So my uncle, who's the mayor of Melbourne and very glamorous, had this modernist house in Troutbeck, if you know Melbourne, and it had a stream going through it that had a current, and he had turtles that lived in this artificial stream. And as a kid, I was like, I have some dipshit 35-gallon tank in my room, and this is like the coolest thing I've ever seen. I totally idolized him. It wasn't until he left office in disgrace in the late 70s that I understood the other side of him, which was he was a drug dealer and involved with prostitution rings in Melbourne. So he was a complicated figure.
And he turned you on.
Oh, we went to see that abysmal Lone Ranger movie. Does anyone remember that terrible movie that came out in 1980? I went to his office. He said, "Oh, well, let's go to the movies." It's very carefree and fun and whatever. So we go to the movies, and we sit down, and he pulls out some cocaine, and he's like, "Let's do some coke, it's noon." So I was, when in Rome, I don't recall anything about feeling anything, but I was excited and appalled.
How old were you then?
18. Yeah.
All right.
Of legal, no.
Well, I'm just thinking we're getting ahead of ourselves.
Oh, sorry.
Because in middle school, you went back, this is what I'm imagining, you went back from seeing his turtle tank and whatever, and then that's when you suddenly needed all these different tanks for...
I already had tanks, but I started to up the ante, and that's when I started to paint, and I said that I didn't paint, but I did paint on the back of these turtle vivariums, like King Kong's jungle or whatever place I thought was a cool landscape to go behind them.
Yes, that's
Fictions.
my next question.
Yes.
And you started to consider a career as a herpetologist, as we've learned recently.
I had about 6 months of wanting to be a herpetologist until, that's a study of reptiles and amphibians, until I was really understood that I had to be good at math, and that was like out of the question.
So were the vivariums for you like dioramas at the Museum of Natural History come to life?
Absolutely.
Okay, I never knew that. And movies are almost as intrinsic to your art as natural history. What movies fascinated you early on, and how did this fascination play out when you were a kid?
I mean, primarily it was King Kong and Ray Harryhausen movies. Does anyone know who Ray Harryhausen was? The stop motion animator who single-handedly made the reason these films exist, like, you know, Jason the Argonauts and Seventh Voyage of Sinbad, the monster creature sequences, he would call them characters. And I was lucky enough to meet him for an afternoon in 1995 and asked him pretty much every question I could think of. He very much handmade and handcrafted suspension of disbelief. 24 frames per second make up the movement in the traditional cinema, and for every frame you have to move this model that you built, like cell animation, one frame at a time to simulate life. So I became so obsessed with that idea of what this was. Can someone close that fluorescent light, that door? That's very distracting. Thank you. That I wanted to do that, and started building my own stop motion animation models and got a Super 8 camera, and didn't really have the patience to follow through. I mean, I wish I'd been older, but I sort of would get halfway through things and then realize how actually challenging it was to have that concentration and,
Still, your childhood bedroom sounds a little bit like a crazy science lab of like...
Yeah, it smelled pretty interesting. Crickets and this and escape snakes.
So how important were immersive worlds like movies and vivariums to you as an only child with parents who were sort of inconsistently present, absent?
They were a lifesaver.
Yeah.
And obviously still, I mean, my work is still connected to that stuff, and
It gave you a sense of control.
Control and enchantment, and got you through the day.
So in high school you gave up the tanks, and then you went to RISD hoping to become a stop motion animator. Is that
Something
right?
like that, yeah.
Yeah. And you also considered becoming an illustrator?
That was later when I got to SVA.
Oh, okay. Well, what brought about the shift to fine art, finally?
I had some really interesting art and ideas mandatory classes at School of Visual Arts, where Mark was also a student, even though we didn't know each other. We heard about each other. That was really smart. One was Lisa Liebman, who used to write for Art Forum, who's unfortunately deceased. And the other is Lorraine O'Grady, who is having a resurgence, a wonderful African-American artist, who I owe tremendous debts to both of them, because they saw probably a combination of like disobedience and something that would get drive to be able to, withstand the struggles, the ups and downs of being a fine artist. And they both encouraged me to be, get out of illustration, which I was out of default because I didn't really know what fine art was, and encouraged me to at least investigate what that possibility was.
But you took a lot of art history courses at RISD too, right?
Yeah, but I saw them at the service, and I love art history, and I woke up every morning for a couple of years and copied an old master drawing just to learn how to draw like Michelangelo if I needed it down the line. But I wasn't clear what that was going to be at the service of, because as far as I was concerned, my mom had friends who were in the so-called fine art world, and they were like, iron and steel sculptors and people like that. And I was like, fuck that, I hate that. For myself.
So who or what inspired you to claim natural history as your artistic territory, quote unquote?
Well, I think Smithson helped me, encouraged me a lot. Robert Smithson, the great sculptor, who, not so much in looking at his work, but I mean, you could see some of the speculative things, like the island that goes around New York is obviously relating to ecology and spiral jetty, but his writings really encouraged me. And it's also out of desperation. It's like, what can I do that's like unique that no one else is doing? And it's not like I felt like I owned it. And obviously Mark had been doing his work in relationship to similar content, even though it looks, pretty much completely different. It was just this idea of like, if Roy Lichtenstein can be a pop artist drawing like, comic books, why can't I do, Golden Field Guides?
Yeah, I was actually, yes. I remember you saying that Ross Bleckner took you aside at some point though and said, you need to have like some sort of identity.
Absolutely. Yeah, he was I worked for him for about 6 months, and it was very heady to see him go from basically almost thrown out of Mary Boone to being a huge success. And to have artists in and around the studio like Barbara Kruger and Julian Schnabel and Troy Brontock and people like that, again, demystified what it took to do that. And he was very generous, and I showed him my work. He's like, "You're talented, but so who cares?" It's like, what are you going to do with your career?
There was some Kiefer reference, wasn't there?
Yeah, I was into, it sort of looked like him and Kiefer, and I was basically very derivative. And he said, if you're going to do this, you have to, you have to have your own voice, and what are you going to do with your life?
And it occurred to me that the pictures generation was important too, because you were making images about natural history. It wasn't really at that point being in the wild.
No, it had nothing to do with leaving.
Plein air painting.
No, I wasn't leaving Manhattan to do these paintings.
So it was all mediated through images.
Through the history and iconography of, received information from reproductions and so on, paintings, illustrations, whatever.
So Hudson River School painters like Edwin Church, to whom you're often compared, depicted beautiful landscapes as almost sacred examples of God's work, yet you present yourself as a defiant atheist. How do you reconcile the sublime and the scientific in your work?
Oh, wow. So, first of all, let's be clear. Church is doing great propaganda paintings that are trying to crush Europe, right? That's the point of those paintings. Like, America has shit going on. Who needs Europe? Even though they owe a huge debt to the history of European painting. And I love Church. I guess if you're thinking about, we go to these places over the decades, and I have a transcendental feeling about nature, which is very in earnest, and I'm very, it's very direct and close to a religious experience. Going to places like Antarctica where we've been together, or Tasmania where we've been together, or places where Mark and I have been together. It is profound, but it's also under incredible threat from human activity. So in order to take these, I'm very disappointed by the crisis that we're in, despairing, to be clear. And those seem almost irreconcilable, and that's what my work is really about, this conflict and turmoil.
It calls to mind David Ramanelli's essay in this book, which he writes, "The great thing to do with beauty is to tack it onto something unpleasant." So you're describing the unpleasant things that you tack it onto, it sounds like.
That's a really interesting point, and I like what David said, but I'd flip it and say I'd take something unpleasant and put it on something beautiful.
Oh.
So
make it beautiful somehow.
Exactly.
It is very seductive, the light and the...
I wanted to get you to the studio.
So your mother, as you said, eventually became an archaeologist, and your biological and adoptive fathers were both jazz musicians. How has this duel between scientific exactitude and improvisation played out in your work? And do you notice any difference between how you approach a painting and how you approach a work on paper?
Well, I guess that's always the battle. It's like information versus the intuitive experience of making work, and that's something I love, that tension. So, if you think about growing up around jazz, which is a combination of very rigorous structure and improvisation, that taught me a lot. And then growing up playing basketball, which has endless improvisation on top of very rehearsed and structured things that you do in order to prepare yourself to be able to exploit opportunities, broken plays, and so on. I'd say that those kind of work beautifully with the way I try to think about my work, which is this combination of opportunities that I could never foresee in planning or thinking about something, and then something I've been thinking about perhaps for years. So in terms of works on paper and painting, obviously paintings tend to have more information in them from my history, and I'm working on a very dense painting that I was working on today, planning. So the paintings tend to be more about density and sort of information, but I've been working on this recent body of work about calving glaciers that are really bringing some of the works on paper back into the paintings, where they're very intuitive and alchemaic and very much about, the physicality of painting. They're very abexy.
Yeah, that's right.
So, with native people's kayaks.
I was thinking actually that this book reproduces, I hadn't seen it I don't think before, but your first mature drawing, which is 1987.
Mature.
And you showed, when you spoke at the Cornwall Library, you showed a slide of your first painting. And at that time you were painting on canvas sometimes and not wood. So I was wondering if the canvas made, because both of those works are kind of washy, like in a way that you sort of move.
That's interesting. Though I think that I was trying to reconcile this idea of I'm doing these sort of images that are based on illustrations from Golden Field Guides and National Geographic, but I'm also using a Trojan horse of color field painting to get it through the door, and that's the way I was thinking about it. It's irrelevant that they're painted on canvas.
Okay. So you already mentioned that you sometimes use field guides and scientific charts and specimen drawings.
And so many things. Very democratic.
But what you haven't said is, like, I remember when we first met, you had a very different process for digging up these images, and could you talk a little bit about that and how?
You mean pre-digital?
Yeah, pre-digital.
I had this typical hanging files of like seagulls, spoonbill, and it would be organized in family, wading birds, and so on, but pre-cladistics, really.
And you went to libraries?
I go to the Mid-Manhattan Library, and I got so sick of these 10 seagulls that I had that had the right light on them. So around 2003, I got my first computer, just as I was starting Manifest Destiny, and it was like a bonanza of new seagull photos. Thank God. And then the foolishness of Flickr. Does anyone know what Flickr is? Right, people put on free content for me to copy for as long as I flip it of their great seagull photographs. It's great.
It was cute the way you clipped those.
I know. I love it too. But it's like a whole nother world.
I know. So in the mid-90s, it almost seemed as if climate change found you and not the other way around. How does your feeling of helplessness towards this and other issues facing the planet affect your art? And how do you avoid, or how do you avoid using art as a bully pulpit? Or do you want to?
I mean, I don't know, art as a bully pulpit is preposterous. It has no muscle in terms of it's a terrible disaster. We're really in trouble.
All right. So
what's the question?
How do you feel about teaching people a lesson?
I'm waving the white flag. It's like, what am I going to do?
So you don't think that art should be separate from your political views?
I mean, that's ridiculous to even think that that's possible, let alone, I would never, everything you do is political, whether you're aware of it or not. So I go in and out of despair and helplessness. Last week was pretty much a disaster in terms of these issues. So we're really fucked.
Yep. So the act of painting confines most...
Thank God there's painting. Painting and love.
The act of painting confines most artists to their studios, but in the name of your field drawings, you've explored the world. You've mentioned a few places that you've been to. Faraway places like Guyana, South Africa, Tasmania, Madagascar, Antarctica. But you've also done things closer to home, like the East End of Long Island, New York City, even the Great Lakes.
And even
Did
our
you use
backyard.
outdoors? Yeah, our backyard.
In the city.
So what would you say all these places have in common for you as an artist?
They're all places I visit and think about, and that's it. I mean, I'm very democratic. I have lots of delight looking in the gutter near a dump. There's all sorts of opportunities there. Anything, I mean, there's life everywhere. It's all interesting. The Gowanus Canal is fascinating. There's more biodiversity in some places than others.
I think one of the sort of interesting things about your field drawings is that you actually, even though you collect the materials on site wherever you are, and they're about creatures and plants and that live in those places or are extinct from those places, as in New York, that you actually make these in your studio. You're not making them in the field.
Yeah, I'm a studio cat.
So how do you reconcile that with Helen Molesworth's claim in your new book that the field drawings reflect your intense engagement with a specific place?
Because it's in the engagement is in the mind, and it doesn't matter where I am physically because I'm thinking about it. And the point of going there is to at least have, I mean, full disclosure, I have dug in the mud and done it all for real, and there have been plenty of times it's raining out and I drive by, I don't even get out of the damn car, I grab a clump of stuff and throw it in a Ziploc bag and keep driving.
So then, to a certain degree, the field drawings are about memory and loss.
Right, they're a diary of, exactly, and they're diaristic. And loss could be extinction also.
That's right, exactly. So your weather drawings, they combine like oil and acrylic, and it sometimes feels as if, well, you mentioned alchemy before when you were talking about the glacier paintings, that it's like some sort of battle that's playing out on the page, like you just sort of let the materials pool and meander. Sometimes even in paintings, like a conservator will call up and say, there's a fly in this painting, and Alexis is like, yeah, because there was a fly in my studio and it landed in the painting, or a mosquito or a moth or whatever.
Yeah.
So how does your fascination with alchemy contrast with the more controlled aspects of your process?
I would die of boredom and never want to make a damn thing, because making something is such a struggle, especially the older I get physically. The alchemy becomes the unexpected, the opportunity for something that I could never think of. It's always, and knock on wood, it's always better than what I was thinking, because if I can get the materials to do something interesting, it'll transform the image from something literal into something that's evocative and poetic to me, and then I might completely rearrange what I'm doing based on what it was while I was making it, and move something around to let this live in a much more interesting way than I ever thought would happen.
Makes sense. I was also thinking that alchemic kind of reaction of materials to themselves is a bit like climate change too, with like, you know, the different air temperatures,
Tempest
and
in a teapot,
crazy weather. So it's
yeah. Oh, let me be clear. We're talking about when I start painting, or obviously watercolors horizontal, or works on paper or horizontal. They all start on the floor as pores and very unpredictable materials that are sort of coming together. It's like an orchestra, and I'm like a chef. I don't know what's going to happen, but I hope it works out. And I have a window of opportunity that's usually about 3 hours.
So origin stories, especially artists who have been written about as much as you have, tend to repeat the same misinformation, which can take on a life of its own. And I'm wondering, are there any origin stories regarding your own history as an artist that you'd like to set straight? Or conversely, are there any you continue to feel attached to? And does that attachment make them any more true?
I can't recall any origin stories that aren't true. Can you?
I'm asking.
Is there anything that you...
I think that you used to live in Peru.
Well, it felt like a long time when I was a kid. I was there for like a summer, and I thought I lived there for 6 years.
And your mom worked for Margaret Mead. It's been repeated many times as if she was like Margaret Mead.
Margaret Mead actually worked for her. Yes, those were, shall we say, embellishments and fantasies, and seemed like a good idea at the time. This is like 30 years ago.
Well, when she worked for him. Or she was the one who told me, because I interviewed her once for something.
God damn it, she told me.
And she was like, I was the assistant of the assistant of the assistant.
Right.
So.
I did.
But
I always
that
knew
has
that
a
she
way
had
of like becoming lore.
I wasn't going to interfere if the Times was going to say it.
Right, exactly. So, what have you been working on lately in terms of watercolors, since we sort of began with watercolors?
I have some in my studio. You want to come see? No, I haven't done a damn thing in works on paper in probably like 6 months.
But you have that Mystic Seaport.
I'm planning, right, I have to make 10 large watercolors. They're as large as maybe 30 of the ones in this book, including, this is cropped, but the one on the cover, which is, if you're wondering what that image is, it's like lying in the grass and looking up and being happy, which is very uncharacteristic for me. But if you look carefully, you might be dead, and it's the insects that are coming to eat you. I am working on 10 large watercolors for this project that I'm doing for the Mystic Seaport Museum that are 52 by 75 inches, and then the painting's 8 by 24 feet. And so far, the watercolors I'm planning are invasive marine species, tree of life, extinct marine species, tree of life, paradox. The tsunami that resulted from the Fukushima, whatever that earthquake was that caused the Fukushima reactor to melt down. That brought a big tidal wave of invasive species all the way across the Pacific and deposited them on the Pacific Northwest. So now there are all these plants and animals that are in Pacific Northwest that used to just be in Japan and Asia, and now there's a crisis of invasive species, and so on and so forth. You get the idea.
Yep. So when your first monograph was published, you were very proud of how much it weighed. How much did it weigh, do you remember?
48 pounds.
I think it was 10 pounds, and I'm wondering if you've weighed this new book.
I have not, and full disclosure, I hate how heavy that damn book is now. And it's just like I'm too old.
I remember saying that it was too heavy for me.
It's so heavy. And it was just about ego and stupidity. This book is the right size, as Goldilocks would say.
I agree. So my final question is for the audience. Do you think that we know each other?
Nervous laughter.
Do we win the newlywed game?
Make it up.
Start with Marilla.
I never knew that you worked with Lorena Brady. I mean, she's such an incredible artist, and her theatrical work. I mean, she positions herself in a lot of her performances, and
Speak up.
I've observed your work for so many decades, and I'm just wondering if there's a plot line and where you would fit in this story. I mean, I know you've done self-portraits as one of your work.
Her lesson was far more about our interactions personally, and frankly, I didn't really know her work. And it was really about what she told me, and I'll be forever grateful. As much as I've ended up liking her work a lot and think she's an important artist, I wasn't really aware of what she was doing at the time, because I wouldn't have known where to see it.
Right. But I mean, I only saw it recently at the Brooklyn Museum, but your work has that theatricality.
That's really separate, but she might have been sympathetic to, I don't even know what she was reacting to when she said that, stop being an illustration and go think about being a fine artist. And I went to, what's the name of the head of the fine art department then?
Gene Siegel.
Exactly. Gene Siegel just said, sure, come on over. So, James.
Can you talk about your glacier paintings and how they relate to ecology and et cetera?
Well, the glacier, I've done maybe 50 paintings and works on paper. They started out as the weather drawings, really. First, I made several in 2005, and then Dorothy and I went to Antarctica in 2008. Was that? Seven. And I had my marching orders to do something for a show that was at Mass MoCA. The curator asked me to make something large for it, and when we got back from Antarctica, I decided I was going to make still the longest work I've ever made, which is 36 feet. 7 individual sheets of paper that accumulated to be 36 feet, portraits of icebergs and ice that I photographed while I was there, almost treating them like portraits of almost extinct, not in this case animals or plants, but phenomenon, because I knew where we were headed, unfortunately. And one of the great things about being in a place where there's ice, the Arctic, or many places have glaciers, including Tasmania, strangely, if you get it high enough. First of all, ice looks like nothing else in the world. It is so weird and beautiful, and it's basically a giant fiber optic. And it's also geology, right? Even though you think of it as it's water, to geologists, it is geology. It just happens to be frozen water. So over the years, I've gone back and forth, and I was invited to do a project for a show David Zwirner last year called At Sea, and I decided that I wanted to revisit this idea of portraits of ice and calving glaciers, and that sort of opened the floodgates as a painting to a sort of new treatment and approach to this idea. And what I particularly am interested in is also the cultures that are in and around ice that make a living there. Native peoples in the north, obviously, there's no humans in Antarctica. And this idea that they're so specialized and dependent and have their own culture, using and exploiting animals exclusively to make a living, which means feed themselves. I've been really interested in making little portraits of the different boats and the different cultures that have managed to make a living that are obviously under direct threat to their way of life. And also, the other thing is that they're fabulous opportunities to make paintings because they're so evocative that you can do all sorts of interesting things with the alchemy of paint.
Didn't you design that painting while we were on our honeymoon?
This is an unfortunate thing we went to the Galapagos on our honeymoon.
The Wi-Fi was very good.
I made sure we had good Wi-Fi, and I got the email from David Zwirner asking me to make a work for it, so I was a terrible husband and became obsessed with this painting while we were on our honeymoon. When we weren't talking to marine iguanas. Ladies first, Elizabeth.
Speaking of terrible husbands, no. You were talking about your process, and with the field paintings, you mentioned that there was a lot of planning that went into it, as Dorothy mentioned. With the glacier paintings, you were talking about the difference there being pouring the paint onto the canvas and seeing what happened. So is there a different approach between the field drawings and the...
Pretty similar. And the pouring comes after everything's been sort of planned and I'm thinking about it, and that's a way to getting... The reason that I want to make the work is that there's just enough information to make me curious about what I can do with it as a piece of reference. So that's how I managed to get out of bed and go.
It's kind of a letting go.
Right.
Control.
Yeah, because then I always leave and I go, oh fuck, I fucked it up, it's terrible. And then I come back and I'm like, wow, it's really cool. Because it does its own thing. You don't know what's going to happen. Don't go check on it after a couple of glasses of wine. Because then you're really going to get confused.
I have 3 questions now.
Uh-oh.
Honeymoon. So you went to the honeymoon with paint supplies?
No. We were we went to the Galapagos thinking.
It's not unthinkable.
Thinking. Next question.
Second question is, when you're coming up with your ideas, do you dialogue with just yourself? Is there other people to dialogue with?
I have many parts of myself and we have a conversation. No, I'll give you an example of a failed project, and I won't name names. I got an incredible opportunity to do something, and I went straight to the person that I wanted to talk to before I even thought about it. And then it became, the project didn't happen. So I went to a scientist without even thinking about what it's going to look like. I said, so what's happened in this field in the last 20 years? So it depends. Yeah, next question.
Yeah, so
I had a third question. Go ahead, Theo, you do.
We'll come back to you in a second. Go ahead. In the back.
All right. So I love the fact that you covered these parts of your background, your childhood with the aquariums and the films, and specifically painting the backs of the aquariums and film. And I'm thinking about the old versions of King Kong, where they employed things called matte painting, where they would paint on sheets of glass, and they would put sheets of glass progressively toward the background so that they could create perspective and all these things. And then there's the Hudson River School painting, and they were all about perfection personified, the perfection of nature, the perfection of God. And then you're moving into this world of painting, and when did you realize that the imperfection was absolutely the best thing of all as a painter? Like pouring the things, like you were just saying, oh my God, I just messed that up. It's like, when did you decide that you were like, it's okay?
The more confident I got, the more I realized that the idea of perfection is a fool's errand, and many things that might be described as perfect are also inert and lifeless.
Yeah.
So, I mean, you can't, I don't know if church, whatever he does is fantastic, if it's highly polished or not Bierstadt as well. I'm not that interested in that exclusively, but there are things about what they're doing that I think are fascinating if they're rubbing against something else that's treated in a different way. So I like to think about, like, the language of painting is like a menu, and you choose things that might be interesting together to make a dish that is a meal.
Very powerful.
Back to your third question, and then we'll go to
The
Tom.
third question is about hope. Do you have, with painting and the field studies and knowing what's going on with the environment, have you lost hope? Do you maintain some kind of hope?
I mean, I have hope for my daily life. I get out of bed, I love my life, I love being up here. We're in Warren, Connecticut. I jump for joy every morning. I look at, have a cup of coffee and talk to Dorothy. But I don't have hope for these issues that we're talking about that have to do with the biodiversity crisis and climate stuff. No, I mean, hope for what? That would be friggin' ridiculous. Tom.
I have just a very narrow biographical question. When you were describing this bizarre childhood bedroom with the turtles and the aquariums and the painting tableaus and the escaped snakes, I was wondering if this atmosphere was one that you were inviting your friends over to, or if you had the opposite instinct to keep it private.
I have no sense of decorum, or I couldn't have cared less about all my friends came over. I was completely transparent about it. But I was also, there were times when I was lonely and would go to other people's houses because my parents I didn't know where they were or what was going on. So I spent a lot of time sleeping at friends' houses too, paradoxically.
Yeah, which contemporary artists do you most admire? Whose work interests you?
There's so many. I mean, ones that are alive. Mark's a great artist. Dana's a very good artist. His wife. Kiefer. Donald Judd. I tend to also like things that look nothing like my work. So there's a sort of minimalist strain in me that I have nothing but resentment for, that I can't live my life that way. But there's lots of inner conflicts about that stuff. There's so many great artists. Smithson.
Alexis, what's in your book? The book?
Yeah.
What's in it?
It's 35 years of works on paper. You should buy it. Sorry, peripheral vision.
No, it's quite all right. I'm quite far on the edge here. You had mentioned earlier about completing a work on insects, and I'm also very fascinated by them as a group of animals, and I'm wondering what fascinates you in particular about them.
They're freaking cool.
Yes.
They look other. They are like incredible. I mean, how they evolved is so fascinating, and why they look the way they do is so mesmerizing. And just if you look carefully at them, I spent, before I made those mud drawings that I mentioned earlier with Mark, I spent weeks and weeks in the Guyanese rainforest drawing with a pencil insects that Mark had caught and killed. He did all the dirty work. And in a killing jar. And we would put them on a pin, and I would sit there for hours and hours with a pencil on a piece of white paper and just look at it and go, what the hell's going on structurally with this thing? It's so interesting.
And didn't your cigarettes run out or something?
No, that was police. That's a different trip. Different trip.
But similar process.
That never happened again.
His graphite ran out.
Yeah, Jim.
So, for most of your career, I guess most of the drawings in that book are watercolors in that book. You had a studio in Lower Manhattan, I think, in a basement.
Mm-hmm.
Now you cross a bridge, a covered bridge, across a picturesque brook. How's that walk to work changing the art you're making?
I don't think at all. I mean, it's a more pleasant place to be, but
I will say that he was worried about that his work was all about longing, and that once he had this around him, that he wouldn't be able to make his work anymore, because he could look at a frog, and why draw a frog when you can look at one? You did worry about that.
true. That's why I made sure that my studio looked almost exactly the same as it did in the basement on Franklin Street. As Mark said, you have sort of a window now.
I have a technical question.
Sure.
And I've always wondered, because your paintings are so masterful and elaborate, and they're on these enormous, large scales. And do you do like pencil drawings before, or do you just paint like? Because you're talking about pouring on the canvas, and so like, do you have an underpainting before you pour on the canvas? Like, how do you construct?
I used to plan it out with tracing paper. This goes here, and now I use Photoshop. All right, I know there's a sky here. I know how I'm going to make that, and I'm going to put a bunch of boats in front of it that I had photographed by the Mystic Seaport Museum, so it's just straightforward.
So you're just like looking at the image on your computer?
I have a shitty ass computer from like 2007 as my studio computer, and I'll have reference on it, and I sort of look at it, and I just...
And then you're just like with your brush and you're pouring?
No, I have a bucket of paint, and I'm pouring it on with a big house painting brush, and then I pour other stuff and manipulate it, and you know.
But then like the detail.
You wait for it to dry, and you pick it up, and you paint a boat on it. So simple.
Stop doing the tracing paper.
Photoshop, it's so much easier.
But you do sometimes project.
I'll project big shapes to get an idea where all right, for instance, I'm working on this big painting. I broke it into two pieces because I don't want an assistant to be helping me. So I have to start it off in two pieces in order to move it. So I'm going to project the water line and measure exactly. So, you know, I haven't done this yet. This is Monday. 14.3 inches down here, and then I'm going to do 14.3 inches down here and project it so it's a line. So when I put it together, it'll match up sort of, and then I'll fuse it together by another session. But, you know, it's just about placing things in a rectangle. I mean, projecting, I always had this fantasy if when I got a digital projector, oh, I'm going to be Richard Estes, the great photorealist. You know, there's the dark. It's a waste of time. You block it in possibly with a crayon where it might go, and then you have to basically do it over, start over. It's like, all right, you better understand perspective. You have to like really find out your vanishing points if you're doing architecture. There's all these things that you have to know how to do. You can't project, or it looks, because there's so much distortion.
Final question?
Uh-oh.
I just want to make a comment. I have watched Alexis paint He's really good with a brush, so he doesn't need things projected. He can look at it and paint, and it's beautiful.
Thank you. Let's get a drink. 5 books.
Beginning of the talk, books are available for sale at the front desk. We have signings.
Jeanette, you had a question?
Please enjoy.
Wait, we have one more question because
It's
Jeanette.
a really silly question, but
Go
do you
ahead.
still have those clippings and the hanging files, and if so, can I see them?
You can see them during my storage and touring thing.
Okay.
And I actually shamefully tossed a lot of it just because it's like, how much can you? I know that damn seagull so well. So no, it was painful.